So who is Christopher Jeffries and what actually happened? So Chris Jeffries was arrested for the murder of a 25-year-old woman who was called Joanna Yeats and was also a landscape architect in December 2010 after she went missing from a flat in Bristol. Her body was discovered on Christmas Day and the autopsy revealed she was strangled. A bit of background on Mr. Jeffries himself: he was a landlord and lived in the same building as Joanna Yeats, but he was also a retired English teacher, and he was questioned by police for 2 days before being released without charge. In January 2011, Vincent Tabak, a 32-year-old Dutch engineer who was also Joanna Yeats' neighbour, was charged with her murder and later sentenced to life in prison after he pleaded guilty to manslaughter. The case highlighted significant privacy law and ethics issues, and Mr. Jeffries has spoken out about his experience and the distress he had to endure. He expressed in his How I Was Hounded piece how no one saw him as Christopher Jeffries, but instead the murderer of Jo Yeats. He was suddenly transformed into a villain, even though he was innocent all along. So Jeffries became the centre of a media frenzy where he was vilified by the press. They attacked his appearance and character, with some headlines like the Daily Star calling him an angry weirdo and had a foul temper. His previous students also nicknamed him the strange Mr. Jeffries, which the Sun made into a headline. This led to readers assuming he was guilty despite lack of genuine evidence. There were over 40 articles published in late December 2010 by newspapers such as the Daily Record, the Daily Express and Scotsman. All of these newspapers wrote headlines and articles with a bias hinting towards Jeffries being guilty. They included adjectives that inclined he was an odd character, and one paper also said that he was obsessed by death. 8 newspapers in the end had to apologise in court to him and had to contribute to the libel damages payout.
So one of the most important laws in this case is the Contempt of Court Act 1981. This case covers strict liability contempt, where publishers can be prosecuted for creating a substantial risk or serious prejudice and impediment to active legal proceedings from the moment of the arrest. Several newspapers published guilt, prejudicial material that implied guilt. These publications risked prejudicing potential jurors if Jeffries was ever charged, and thus creating a risk to the court proceedings. The court emphasised that articles create a risk to justice through the vilification of Jeffries, and that the impact of the articles on potential witnesses was damaging. The consequences of this were 2 newspapers, the Sun and the Daily Mail, were found guilty of the Contempt of Court Act and were fined by the High Court. Another law is defamation. However, this case occurred before the Defamation Act in 2013, so the Defamation Act 1996 was still in formation at the time. So defamation protects individuals from unjustified attacks on their reputation. To prove this in civil court, a claimant must prove defamation, identification, publication, and serious harm. A statement is defamatory if the individual is exposed to hatred, ridicule, or contempt, if they're shunned or avoided, and being lowered in the right estimation of right-thinking members of society. This applies to the Jeffries case because the media coverage implied Jeffries was odd, guilty, or dangerous. This material was published widely in national newspapers and online. Coverage caused serious harm to his reputation. A trial by the media meant national humiliation and lasting stigma. Newspapers could not rely on the defences of truth, as the allegations were proved to be false. Honest opinion, as the reports were presented as factual, and public interest, as the coverage was sensationalised. The newspapers therefore paid substantial damages and issued apologies, and this case became a leading example of trial by media and informed the Leventon inquiry. So aside from obviously defamatory headlines, under the juxtaposition principle, journalists must adhere to this article, as this article is considered defamatory. The layout of the image of Jeffries is next to the headline, although it doesn't explicitly say it implies to guilt. Placing the content side by side can be defamatory. Privacy law, the Human Rights Act 1998, Article 8 of the ECHR states everyone has the right to respect for his privacy, family and home life. Thus, Jeffries has a reasonable expectation of privacy as a private individual, and he was not ever charged with a crime. Privacy was breached because the media published intrusive, speculative and sensationalised material, with Jeffries never even being charged, publishing exaggerated or distorted descriptions of his behaviour and lifestyle, implying guilt, printing interviews with former pupils and suggesting oddness, styling personal characteristics, hairstyle and habits to sensationalise suspicion. Although some of this was defamatory, it also is considered a serious invasion of privacy as the press treated him like a public figure despite no evidence of wrongdoing. It was also a violation of the Article 6 of the ECHR presumption of innocence. The UK law prohibits media from portraying someone as guilty without being charged if a case happened post 2018 on account of the Cliff Richards versus the BBC case. Jeffries would not have been allowed to be named. The coverage of the arrest was not proportionate, not responsibly sourced, and caused serious harm. The court must balance Article 8 privacy and Article 10 freedom of expression and favoured privacy for Jeffries.
There were also some ethical issues that went wrong. The Christopher Jeffries case highlighted several breaches of UK journalism ethic and codes under IPSO. The first major breach was Clause 1 of accuracy, and Clause 1 requires journalists to publish information that is accurate, verified, and not misleading. However, newspapers including The Sun and Mail Online published inaccuracies and false rumours about his relationships and family background, building a narrative that he was creepy and odd. None of these claims were ever backed by police evidence or witnesses, and the breach was so severe that it resulted in multiple liable damages paid to Jeffries. The second breach was Clause 2 privacy, which requires journalists to respect one's private life unless there is public interest. However, in this case, newspapers were invasive, publishing personal details despite there being no public interest justification into Chris Jeffries. This included reports on his appearance and personal mannerisms, framing them as suspicious. Reporters also wrote about his home life and contacted his old friends, colleagues, and even former students. Furthermore, Clause 3 harassment of the IPSO Editor's Code was also breached. Clause 3 states that journalists must not engage in harassment or intimidation. However, in this case, Jeffries was unable to go out because of the press, calling it psychological torture, and he felt hounded after reporters camped outside his house for hours, followed him aggressively in the streets, and tried to take pictures of him within his own home. This very clearly violated IPSO standards. Ofcom codes were also breached. The first code was to avoid harm and unjustified offence, which is Section 2. Section 2 states that content must not create unjustified harm or offence. In this case, media coverage risked causing unjustified harm by using harmful and damaging language against Jeffries, who had not yet faced any charges. And the second code was due impartiality and due accuracy, which is Section 5.1. And under 5.1, broadcasters must report fairly and accurately. And in this coverage of Chris Jeffries, sensational labels like creepy or weird violated this standard. These labels suggested guilt without evidence and damaged fair reporting and public opinion. Another code was avoiding unfairness in Section 7.1, which says that broadcasters must avoid treating individuals in an unjust or unfair way. Implying that Jeffries was guilty before evidence or charges had emerged was highly unfair reporting, and it violated this standard. The last section was protecting privacy in Section 8.1. Broadcasters must respect people's privacy and avoid unnecessary intrusion. All of the coverage of Chris Jeffries' private life was unjustified.
The reaction of the media. The Chris Jeffries situation was described as a trial by media, where publications decided one perspective before attaining all the information, leading to difficult and even traumatic period for Chris Jeffries. Media outlets published Jeffries' name and sensationalized background before any formal charge was made. Tabloid publications used rumours and judgment on appearance to construct a demonised narrative fueled by sensationalism. There was alleged evidence that off-the-record police briefings were held, leaking information to the press of Jeffries' guilt before real evidence had been collected. Jeffries himself called an independent inquiry into these potential criminal leaks. The Leveson inquiry used the Jeffries case as a key example of what can go wrong when media and law enforcement practices converge uncritically. The inquiry concluded that when the story becomes too big and public appetite insatiable, many media outlets sacrificing accuracy and fairness, leading to coverage that is unbalanced, prejudicial, and wildly inaccurate. The report emphasizes that media intrusions can cause real, often lifelong damage to innocent individuals, reputational destruction, psychological trauma, social isolation. Jeffries was explicitly highlighted among several victims of the hunt for a scoop. It concludes to say that Jeffries case clearly showed a systemic issue within the media, namely tabloid publications that search for sensationalist stories over real evidence-based journalism. There are a few key issues with the media industry that the Jeffries case highlighted. Defining public interest is subjective, while qualifies as justified motivation releases details of someone's identity may still be contested. Speed versus accuracy. Due to insistent commercial pressures, the priorities behind publishing a story have often become warped, leading to premature reporting before they have all angles and information. However, regulation must not impede the free press, despite obvious safeguards needing to be put in place to avoid future situations that mirror that of the Chris Jeffries case. Genuine investigative journalism, public interest reporting must be upheld in balance with personal dignity and fair trial.
Thank you for watching.